Thank you so much for your time. I don't know if you've read some of the boards or had a chance to visit all of the stations. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes afterwards to gather maybe any additional comments. Again, I want to remind you, if this is a quick process. We could do this probably all week and continue the conversation and continue to have great input. But if you feel like you haven't had a chance to speak, we'll make sure that we stay around a few minutes after this event. But we will have pins and comment cards. If you want us to follow up with you directly, leave your email address or your phone number, or I'll be more than happy to provide you my phone number or my email address. You're welcome to call us as well. We want to make sure that this is, honestly, we want to make sure that this is a plan about and from Broken Arrow and your ideas. We heard a lot of ideas, some amazing ideas, so I'll share a little bit just in terms of initial feedback. But we've got James. First of all, I want to say what a great facility, what a great host. We showed up here about 11 o'clock. We've been kind of hanging out and loitering, drawing, and cutting up in the back. We've been behaving ourselves. We know we're in church. But thank you, James, and the staff here. I want to give you a round of applause just for... and we'll pass the hat later, and you guys keep the money. Is that how that works? No, thank you. We realize you don't have to make your facility available, and we really appreciate you doing this. So with that, is AJ here? Oh, he's in the front row. Also, I want to mention we're not doing this alone. We've got complete city support. Staff has been amazing. They've made themselves available to us as we have questions and data needs and information and history. And we also have a great partner, ADG, out of Oklahoma City. AJ grew up here. He knows the area. And so we've got a great team with ADG. And so we're not doing this together. This takes a team. We've got a very talented team. We've been involved in other projects before across the state, and it's great to be able to work directly with them on this project. So without further ado, if you'll advance the slide, I just want to give you a little bit of feedback on what we're seeing. This is a picture. We actually are doing some work in Sacramento. I love this image. Every day is your chance to make the city a little bit better, because the city can't fund their way out of it. Everyone has to do their part, and so we're glad. We're thankful that you're here, because we truly think that you have a great city, and it's going to take all of you to really make this plan a success. You're going to have to eat there and shop there and hang out there, and hopefully we'll help stimulate businesses and get the framework right. But we want to make sure it's a place that you can enjoy. The goal of this is we've got to figure out, in terms of market and design, how to target those opportunities that have the greatest propensity for success. We want to leverage the history here. We want to leverage the things that you remember most. I've got a number of factors. That's one of the reasons why we did a factor. What's important in terms of underscoring what's important to you. And then we've got to try to figure out how to harness that and advance the thinking into the future. We all shop differently than we did 8 years ago. We're in a very unique environment. We came out of probably the worst economic cycle that we've ever been in. Now we're in the best economic cycle, so predicting the future in those two dynamics is very difficult. But our job is to make sure that the plan is done in a very meaningful way, that it captures what's important to you, but it also is doable, achievable, it's financeable, and it's feasible. And so that's really our role. For us, and this is why I'm glad that we're here with ADG and the city, that the most powerful projects are not planning projects. They're not economic development studies. It's really a combination where you can link economic development ideas and market with the city behind you, and great land use planning in terms of illustrating the vision where it becomes powerful. This is why this is a study. Our job, our real role, is to figure out an activation plan. And that's what we've been charged with, and we're going to be held accountable, is we've got to figure out ideas that we can actually advance and make happen, so that a year from now, you're not talking about meeting about another study or another plan, but you're actually seeing new business, private investment, maybe a little bit of public investment to stimulate that, but this actually becomes a plan. Yes, ma'am? So we are in today is within the very beginning. We've been doing a little bit of homework, a little bit of thinking. Both us and ADG have been gathering some existing conditions. We'll share with you where we're at. Over the next probably 2 or 3 months, we'll be refining these ideas, sharing these back with you and the city. But by the end of the summer, we hope to have a plan adopted and a go-forward strategy. So this is moving very quickly, and we want it to. As you know, or many of you are aware, the city is also concurrently engaged in a comprehensive plan that addresses, essentially, it's a business plan for the entire city. We're also engaged in that, so this process is not being done in a vacuum. We'll also be involved in that regional plan, and we'll make sure that both the regional goals are overlaid in terms of the thinking here, but also some of the thinking and some of the activation ideas and strategies are also related back to the overall plan, and I think that's a great opportunity in terms of leveraging your resources. And then this plan, essentially, I can't reinforce enough, this is about focusing on people, physical places, and innovative policies, not radical policies, but innovative policies that can advance this intersection as a choice to perhaps live, work, play, eat, and shop. And I know that seems so contrived and overused, but when I was reading some of the ideas in the vision, I think this really captures some of the things that you guys are mentioning that you want, or you want back, or want more of. So next slide. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit of information in terms of our current understanding. Again, we're a couple of months into this process, so we've been looking at a lot of data, a lot of demographics. If you advance the next slides, we'll share with you a little bit of the background. This is actually a picture of the subdivision that AJ and his family had. So in talking about leveraging experiences, we've got a lot of history and background and information already. So this is actually the subdivision plat for the subdivision adjacent to the study area. Next slide. And we also have to think about, in terms of existing conditions, that this process is not in a vacuum. We've got to think about the existing retail nodes. So if you look at the blue, you see the Warren Theater and the other regional retail nodes. This has got to be unique. It's got to be differentiated. It can't be exactly like some of the other intersections. I think the Rose District is an amazing example of success and what can be done. It's still evolving and maturing, but for us, when we see new housing and new investment going in, that's a good sign that the city really got that right, and you guys got that right. But there's a lot of green and infill areas. There's over 3,000 new residential units in and around South Broken Arrow that will influence this intersection, I think, in a very positive way in terms of just redeveloping and redesigning that in a way that makes sense for the market. Next slide. But all of this is not in a vacuum. This is a very competitive retail environment. There's been a lot of questions in terms of retail format and Hobby Lobby leaving. Essentially retail is going to go where there's a greatest concentration of their customer base, and gravity matters, co-tenancy matters, and so you've seen as new infrastructure gets built, the new interstates, and we see this all over the United States. Well, you get anchors that want to be more regional. That attracts some of the other guys, and where shopping centers like Elm 101 or Elm New Orleans are aging, then those new retailers want to relocate and kind of reinvent themselves and open up new formats. And so for us, that's an opportunity. But this is a very competitive market, both in terms of Tulsa and Broken Arrow. We look at this plan and the intersection as kind of cooperation, right? You've got to figure out what actually makes sense for the neighborhood and then reintroduce that. We've been working on, we have a tremendous amount of analytics in terms of data where we can actually start to match tenants that make sense for this intersection. We've already been sharing new ideas, and we'll talk about the retail viability. The other issue is just, and many of you mentioned this, some of these buildings are tired and they're old, and some of them are probably not functional in terms of the format. The majority, not all, but the majority of retailers have shrunk their floor plans, and some of the space is too deep and too wide to fit a number of formats, and so it either needs to be reformatted or reconfigured, or we need to pursue tenants that can fit in that format. Today, it's very auto-oriented. I know that's probably an understatement, We walked and got a quick drink, and it is not a great walk. You don't feel safe. There's a lot of traffic. And so how can we create an opportunity to bring back, I got many comments in terms of connectivity, but how can you bring that back? Although I do feel like that this, will always be, it may not be auto-dependent, but I think, it still needs to be accessible. I think in terms of its position, the way it's positioned makes sense, but we can make it more walkable, make it more enjoyable, and certainly provide a reason first, but then and introduce additional connectivity into the neighborhoods. So, next slide. And then you have other issues in terms of, one, the market shifted, but you also have changing demographics. If you look at the demographics in and around Elm and New Orleans, the demographics look different here than they do in other places of the city. That's very natural. There's older houses, people are aging in place. We have a lot of new young families. I think over 50% of the population now around the intersection is under 55. And so you've got two different markets, but that also changes the types of tenants that you pursue. And so we're seeing more medical come in, and so we want to be able to respond to that. And so part of that will be the overall strategy. Lack of synergy and gravity. While you have some really good uses in different places, it's sort of all things to all people today. Certainly it's a little bit more disorganized, and you probably wouldn't merchandise any of those centers the way that they're merchandised today if you had a blank slate. All of this has evolved over time, and so part of this will be bringing those new ideas back. And some of the issue is there's a lot of fragmented ownership, so trying to move in one direction with 5 property owners that have different visions and different goals and different investment strategies is very, very complicated. For us, it's fun. Maybe we're crazy. But there's also legacy ownership. There's people that own the property and have different reasons, and sometimes no decision is still a decision, but sometimes making no decision or not doing anything is safe. And so that's very complicated. There's certainly legacy issues, and so we have to work through a lot of different nuances in terms of developing the strategy. So it's not easy, but it is doable. Next slide. And so what we're looking for is, what tools can we use to increase vitality? Obviously the public investment must match private expectations. And so we've got to figure out how to calibrate, maybe a new street facade, but we need to make sure that actually stimulates new investment so that that money is well spent and well used and leveraged. We've got to take maybe advantage of national trends and just a preference to have more walkable places. I heard a million comments of being quality uses and hangout places and places for families to really enjoy. Maybe that's around a small park. It doesn't have to be a huge park, but we've already been thinking about some of those ideas. And then how can you leverage the existing base? There's a ton of people. The purchasing power around this area is unbelievable. We'll look at some information in terms of where the customer shed is coming from that actually shops at Elm in New Orleans today, but it's actually really impressive. We know there's a market there. How do you harness that? And the other is how to harness the regional growth that you're already occurring. There's over 500 units of single-family housing today. So how can we utilize this opportunity in some of the vacant parcels to take advantage of that? And so our goal is to take all of this and explore really what is the art of the possible, and how can you take the existing conditions and some of the constraints and the market opportunity and really drive that forward. And this is why you're ultimately here. So next slide. So we've already been thinking about other places. Some of the things that you've mentioned today, the Town Center Plaza in Midwest City, Oklahoma. And the relationship and the connectivity between the neighborhoods and some of the shopping centers. I think that was done in a more meaningful way, maybe a more progressive format that makes sense today. And just in terms of looking at massing, City Line project in Richardson in terms of density, a great grid structure, again, adjacent to existing neighborhoods, but a lot of corporate opportunity. So we've heard some interest in bringing jobs into the intersection. I don't know that it'll be to the scale of State Farm, but and certainly thinking about the relationship and the importance of providing quality spaces in terms of being attractive to maybe a new workforce, maybe a new retail, and sort of how this is arranged. We looked at the Rose District just in terms of the context and scale, and it's interesting. all of these maps are essentially at the same scale, so you can see the difference in density and layout and format of sort of new, evolved places versus some, today, the district. And then other places, we looked at FM 423 in El Dorado and Little Elm. It's a great example of a quality place around a green space with quality retail around it, and then even the Shops of Legacy at Plano. Again, we're not trying to impose any of these places, but there's a lot of good examples of connectivity, healthy choices, community places that we can draw from, of good examples of places that are very successful and are vital today. So next slide. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just existing conditions. I'm going to have AJ come up and just kind of walk through some of the initial findings today.
Thank you, Jason. So my name is AJ Kirkpatrick. I'm the Director of Urban Planning at ADG. As Jason mentioned, we're in Oklahoma City, the west side of downtown. We are most known for being the program manager for the MAPS sales tax in Oklahoma City. So I do need to correct Jason a little bit, because there are people in the room that know my family. I did not grow up in Broken Arrow, but my family goes back to the 20s in Broken Arrow. And my grandmother has lived in Vandiver Acres since 1963, and both my parents are from Broken Arrow, class of 66. So I did grow up my entire life coming to this intersection. So I remember distinctly at least two movies, Tarzan and The Golden Eye, that I saw at that movie theater. So I have seen it at its best, and I've watched it, and I've talked to my grandmother over the years as it has changed into what it is today. And so thanks to the city for letting us work on this. It always makes my grandmother very happy to have me back in town. And so it's just so exciting to have an opportunity to give back to Broken Arrow, because it means so much to our family. So go ahead and skip to the next slide. So this is the study boundary that we established. We went ahead and made it a little larger than initial discussions, because as we started to look at it, as Jason mentioned, there is a lot of developable land within a short distance. And that's fairly unique in a lot of these suburban strip malls that are starting to end their first generation of life. A lot of times they've already been built around. You guys have a lot of untapped potential, and that land around there could be developed for something that's a higher density that could actually make the strip mall, the retail portions of this, much more attractive to retailers long term. We also made sure to include the school. We understand that there is a big discussion right now about what happens with Broken Arrow's high school system. That could play a role in this, and so we're wanting to make sure that we're getting feedback on where that's going as well. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is the existing zoning. Just generally, green is agriculture right now, red is retail, and yellow is residential. So there may be a recommendation down the line to rezone some of this to allow for more mixed use. We have a history in our country of really separating land uses by zoning, and there is I think some general support of if this is going to be a more walkable community, maybe giving property owners the opportunity to do some more mixing of land uses. I should also point out that it's a little hard to see on this, but a lot of those dotted lines are planned unit developments, which is a separate zoning tool. So a lot of these don't really correspond to the base zoning. They're more of the negotiated PUD tool. So you guys did use a lot of PUDs in the initial development of this intersection. Go ahead. So in terms of topography, drainage, I'm going to go ahead and ask Jason Cotton, our civil engineer, to step up and just talk a little bit about what he's seeing on the site.
Thanks, AJ. And I am not from Broken Arrow, but I have a very high opinion of people who are, because I know AJ. So thanks, AJ. So yeah, we've spent some time. We've studied this site a little bit. So I'm not going to bore everyone with a lot of, I'm a civil engineer by trade, so I do all the things, design the things that no one cares about until they don't work, right? It's all the stuff in the ground. And so topography is one of the things that we deal with, drainage. You can see from this slide here, generally this site is kind of divided into an east and west side. Those of you that are familiar with the area, maybe have grown up around here, probably can acknowledge a little bit of this. So, nothing really surprising here, I don't think, or anything to be alarmed about. The site seems to drain relatively well. You can go ahead. There's a FEMA special flood hazard area off to the east of the site, which really doesn't have much to do with us, but it is over there. Go on to the next slide. So this is just a slide to kind of summarize some of the utility infrastructure that's out on the site. So as most of you know, this area of town is very heavily loaded in terms of utility infrastructure. Almost everything is loaded out at the public roadway corridors at Elm and New Orleans. So, you know, it's really good for development. They've got all the services that they need there. You know, it does come with some drawbacks. You know, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about is all of the existing overhead utilities that are down these corridors, which is not unusual. I would say the one thing that's unusual about this area is that it's actually on both sides of the corridor in some areas. So, you know, I'm not, at this point in the game, we're not sure what can be done about that. We're going to kind of reconsider that and see if there are some opportunities there. But you have a lot of overhead infrastructure in this area of town. So. The other thing I would add before we go to the next slide, I was at the existing conditions board out there, which is the boring one, right? Because it's talking about the way that it is today. It's like no one wants to come to a public meeting and talk about stuff like that. But I did not hear a lot of complaints. You know, that's kind of what I expect sometimes when I come to public meetings like this is, you know, if you're manning a table like that, it's like all the people coming by saying this, you know, before you do anything, you need to fix this. My yard drains, or there's traffic, or I didn't get any of that. So that, to me, is a really good sign that in terms of public infrastructure, this area of town is very well served. You can go on to the next slide. This is something on parking counts. I'm going to turn it back over to.
So yeah, thanks to have Jason here. The last thing we want to address here is parking counts. You guys have a ton of parking. If you look at the aerial for Google Maps, go home tonight and pull this up on Google Maps. And at that particular time that photo was taken, I would guess less than 20% of that parking that you're seeing up there is being used at that particular snapshot. On the bright side, that means that there's a lot of opportunity to do some infill building. And you know, that's kind of what we're trying to get at with the boards, and what we'll be building out more in the development scenarios of what sort of infill buildings do you want? Do you want some retail that lines the frontage? Is there some potential to start to maybe do some more mixed-use development, some residential? But just to show that we have counted every single parking spot, and we know how many are here. So with that, I believe, go ahead and hit the next one. I think that was my last. I'll go ahead and hand it back to Jason to talk about trends.
Thank you. So I'm going to get into just a little bit of the market work, talk about some of the regional impacts. If you go to the next slide. One of the things in going forward, and we had a little bit of discussion, there's a couple of things that happen as shopping centers get older. You have lower rents, then you have less money as a landlord, and you essentially can't reinvest in the center. But also tenants, essentially, as things get older, generally start to reduce the amount of sales volumes, and again, they have an issue in terms of reinvesting. So the things that we've seen working, and these are some of the things that we'll be exploring as opportunities here, is those districts that have experiential opportunities that are really engaging, that are active, and so taking advantage of some of the streetscape and infilling some of the parking lots with destination restaurants or other places, and starting to really fill in, I think makes sense. We heard a lot about connectivity, and that's a good thing. Walkable places in terms of what's important to people today are very important, and we see a lot of opportunities in terms of quality connections between the neighborhood and the commercial centers. And so we'll be looking at those opportunities and just making it mixed use environments. And that's already occurring naturally. There's a lot of mixed uses. We just have to figure out how to reorganize a little bit better as the market continues to evolve and take advantage of it. But essentially, quality design will lead to higher efficiencies over time. So this is not something that we're going to be able to create a silver bullet. Better design, better framework, a strategy with a good vision will create higher revenues and reinvestment, will allow for increased output, and ultimately help you start to attract better tenants. And so, this is probably, a 6-month plan and process, but really a 3 to 5 year process in terms of really getting critical mass. And so, just in terms of setting expectations. Next slide. And in a lot of the questions that we've heard already from a lot of the stakeholder input, is retail still relevant? Do we have too much retail at the intersection? And so we've been doing a lot of research in tandem with ICSC, International Council of Shopping Centers, a group that I'm intimately involved with. And although it's interesting, retail sales essentially back in 2006 was about 6% of your spend. Today, most people spend about 13% of their retail goods online. That's a big number. 10 years ago, it was probably closer to 2 or 3%. So we've gone from 2 or 3% over to 13% spend. That has its place. I'll tell you the categories that have been most impacted are general merchandise, things that Amazon sells. That's why Target and Walmart and all these guys are reformatting themselves, trying to figure out how to catch up. Apparel, furniture, and those categories. So sort of more of the durable hard goods and some of the commodity stuff. What you can't replace, you can't replace a movie theater experience or a restaurant online, although I've tried it. Frozen food in the mail is not very good. So those things that are experiential, those things that create engagement, we heard some things about education and cultural, and mixing these uses in a meaningful way is still very, very relevant. Next slide. And what's even more important is that most of the companies that only have an online presence are not profitable. Those that are have a very high return rate. So when you have companies that are creating online formats, most of those have very successful brick and mortar stores. The net sale is much greater. And so we just wanted to underscore that although I think there's a lot of retail at the intersection, and some of that probably will become mixed use, some of the retail could be reformatted. We truly think, and our data shows that retail is viable. We'll continue to explore other options and other ideas as we go forward. Next slide. And so as we started thinking, we started doing some evaluation and just Broken Arrow spend in certain categories compared to just the Tulsa greater MSA. And the good news is you guys spend a lot of money on retail-related issues, a lot of money on food away from home. You spend generally 10% more on overall expenditures in terms of restaurants, 10.9% more here in Broken Arrow than even just the Tulsa general region. Interesting fact, last year was the first year in U.S. history that people actually spend more money eating out away from home than they do at home. So the traditional grocery stores, the things like Reese's, they're having to get very competitive in reformatting and providing more packaged food in places where you can actually take food to go. For that very reason, the way that we shop is different, but also the way that we buy groceries and purchase in general behavior is much different. Next slide. And one of the things that we've been spending time with, and this gets into the regional geography, we actually have technology that can measure who is shopping at Broken Arrow, and that basically feeds back to how to create a trade area. So every red dot is a customer that essentially was shopping at Elm in New Orleans at one point in time over the last year, and the distribution of where they live. So this is very helpful in terms of developing a strategy, because we can start to see information in terms of block group. Who is that customer? Who is the target audience? Who lives around the area? And then really getting into understanding the needs and the spend. We talk about things in terms of leakage. Leakage is what money is available here that you have to spend, but the uses aren't here, and so you're actually spending that elsewhere. And so we'll look at a lot of things in terms of retail leakage and how to reverse some of those trends. Next slide. And so we know that essentially there's over 70,000 people that essentially we have access to in terms of the trade area. That's a really strong number. If you add that up and look at the purchasing power for the overall community, there's over $4.9 billion of purchasing power for the community. And if you think about that, that supports up to almost 4 million square feet of retail. Just alone looking at this intersection, we've got about 500,000 square feet of supportable retail at this sort of trade area within the Elm in New Orleans. So we know that retail is viable. It's just a matter of what retail makes sense and what's going to be successful. And then in terms of categories that make sense, so this gives me, we sort of had to pause. There's a lot of grocery activity in the area. Is there still grocery vitality? We've heard a lot of conversations in terms of Reese's. Grocery was one of the strongest categories in terms of demand today at the intersection. So I think grocery is going to be a big component going forward in terms of neighborhood. You may have a format change, you may have a brand change, but that could be a good thing. Or Reasers may decide to take advantage of the information and stay and hopefully redevelop and reformat their store. General merchandise, furniture, sporting goods. Again, this list is fairly deep, but these are some of the major categories that we see in terms of having capacity and opportunity. Next slide. And so we'll talk a little bit about just next steps and interventions, and this is really why you're here. Next slide. We're going to look at some of the ideas that we've already heard, we've already been thinking about, and I want to show you some examples in terms of the public realm and some of the things that we've seen in other places that I think make sense and are starting to relevant as our thinking has already started to evolve.
So these are just some ways that we think we can start to intervene. You know, whenever the private market starts to fail, these are some ways that we've seen, even in Oklahoma communities, some solutions that have helped to turn the tide. I'm going to share with you a couple of streetscapes from Oklahoma City, where I'm from. But I know that people are very familiar with the Rose District. That's an example of streetscaping in more of an urban setting. I think a lot of people in the room would say that that was a big success in terms of getting the sidewalks, the pedestrian crossings back up to something that really allowed private redevelopment to begin to occur. So this is Western, near downtown Oklahoma City. Go ahead and click. This is the before. This is the after. So some very simple things. They added some landscape medians, added some trees. In this case, they put in some bike lanes. We're not necessarily saying that we're going to put bike lanes on 101st or on New Orleans or Elm here, but just to show you how big of a difference that makes visually. Go ahead to the next one. So we've also recently in Oklahoma City, we've re-streetscaped our entire downtown, which is a major undertaking under the name of Project 180. This is Reno, just south of the Mary Gardens. If you've been to a Thunder game, you probably have looked down this portion of Reno before. So this is the before in 2007. Go ahead, and this is after Project 180. So, you know, this is not something that Broken Arrow has done historically on your suburban arterials, but this is something that we do see in comparable suburban communities. You go to Johnson County in suburban Kansas City, you go to Edmond outside of Oklahoma City. These are some of the things that suburban communities are doing on some of the key parts of their community they really want to highlight. Go ahead to the next one. So these are just some other examples, some of the benefits of landscape medians. The one up there is you can start to brand the area. That's something we've talked about. Maybe giving the intersection a name that you guys can refer to a little easier. Start to give some street trees, some landscaping, something that really starts to beautify the area. You know, you guys have done a very good job of marking the Rose District up there in the upper corner. Maybe you can start to do some signage or markers for the district in those medians. Edmond is another great example. That's their landscape median as you enter town, and you really know that you've entered their community. Those things are really important too in terms of some of the things that the city manager talked about today earlier. You know, it is important that you're spending your money in Broken Arrow, and it's important to have those visual reminders to people that they know where they're spending their money, because that is supporting the city. And then finally, we see some potential maybe for doing some stronger pedestrian crossings, just with some simple paint. These are called zebra stripes or continental striping, starting to give people a better sense of where they're supposed to be and where cars are not supposed to enter when they're stopped. And then finally, with those medians, it gives people, especially when you're dealing with some streets that are 7 lanes wide in some cases, it gives them some place of respite, some place to rest as they're trying to cross 7 lanes of traffic, and some sense of security there. So go ahead to the next one. So these are a little hard to see on my version. I just wanted to show you there are a lot of overhead lines in this intersection, and that makes streetscaping a little bit difficult. It makes it hard to do decent street trees because you can't grow up into the lines. You see a couple examples on the upper right where they've planted some in front of the Ross store, but they're ones, again, that are ornamental, can't really get very tall. And then over by, in front of Hobby Lobby, the old Hobby Lobby space, they've planted some crepe myrtles, but again, those are things that aren't able to get very high. So go ahead to the next one. I'm sorry, go back. Let me make one more point on that. So I think, again, if we don't change the overhead lines, which I think is going to be a big topic of conversation moving forward from some of the things we've looked at today, Either you start to look at ways to maybe take those underground, reroute them around the area so that you're able to do more. At the very least, you can get some trees in those medians. And it's going to change the way that traffic works through the intersection. And those are some things that we can look at with our civil engineer a little bit more. But I think that's a real low-hanging fruit here that you can do to start to beautify this intersection. Okay, go ahead. Another thing is, long-term, it seems like it makes sense to start looking at how you can get bicycles and pedestrians through this corridor a little bit better. In particular, I mean the New Orleans corridor. You've got the Innovation District on the far end. You eventually want to start figuring out ways to get people to be able to ride their bike, maybe even take a bus down that corridor. So if we don't want to put a bike lane in the actual roadway, if we don't want to talk about shrinking down the size of that roadway to make that happen, one way that we can accomplish that is, this is an example from Lawrence, Kansas, on Clinton Parkway. It's a very high traffic volume suburban arterial, very similar to what Broken Arrow has in a lot of places. But here they've done a 10-foot wide bike ped path, and it's off the roadway, so it feels very safe. There's enough distance or width there so that somebody riding on a bike can get by you safely if you're walking slower. Jason mentioned we walked to the convenience store today. We actually had a guy, you have these tiny 4-foot sidewalks, and we had a guy on a bike run up behind us, so we all had to jump out into the grass. So this is a way that maybe we could do this off the street. Go ahead to the next one. And then this is an example that Jason showed earlier on the slide with the 6. I want to jump back to it. It's Midwest City, so it's Oklahoma City. It's a very achievable solution here. If you haven't been to this, I encourage you to go there if you're ever in Oklahoma City. So just notice that this is a traditional strip center, but right in the center there, they've turned some of the liner buildings in on themselves, and they put a little park there, a little pocket park. And what it does for that experience has a major difference than if you're at your typical strip big box center. And I want to go to the next slide, and I'm going to take you down into that park, and this is what that feels like inside. So in that space now, Midwest City doesn't have a traditional downtown, so this is effectively turned into Midwest City's downtown. They have farmers markets, they have movies, that's the farmers market there. They do Halloween, they do Christmas events there. And this is all in front of a strip mall because of the way that they use those buildings to define that space. So today, and a lot of the things that we've been drawing out with your staff, these are some of the solutions that we've been playing around with, is how do we turn those liner buildings so we can start to define that space a little bit better, make it a little bit more human scale. Go ahead to the next one. So lastly, let me finish on the topic of tactical urbanism. We're going to give you guys up to 3 scenarios of how this could build out. We'll probably have one that's intermediate and some very small things that could be done, like streetscapes and retenanting. And then we're going to have one that's very far out in the future, 20, 30 years in the future, where we start to talk about moving some really big boulders around in the intersection. But tactical urbanism is a really important thing that's, you probably, a couple years ago, people started talking about pop-up this and pop-up that, pop-up parks, pop-up retail. So this is a way that with very minimal investment, you can start to change the space a little bit, start to redefine it again into a human scale, maybe take advantage of the existing markets you already have. I remember next to Hobby Lobby for years, that was a film processing drop-off kiosk, and I've never seen anybody there in 10 or 15 years on that side of Hobby Lobby. That's a perfect example of one where maybe you get a snow cone stand or you get a ice cream stand. They start to define their space a little bit with some fake grass, put out some benches, maybe create some walls. That's tactical urbanism. That's a way to start to get people to reimagine what is possible in that intersection. So we're looking for some solutions along those paths as well. So go ahead to the next slide. Just some similar examples in Oklahoma City. I worked at downtown Oklahoma City. One of the things we did in our parking lot is we actually created a basketball court. And you wouldn't believe how popular that basketball court became in our downtown. And then finally, that middle one is an example I just saw last week in Washington, D.C. All they did is they took some shipping containers, stacked it up, turned it into a giant courtyard, had some drinks, had a stage, and it was full of people. And so, we're going to be looking again at some solutions along those lines of where can we do that short term so that we can start to redefine that space for everyone and start to get people to start to imagine what else could be happening here. Go ahead. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
All right, so the good news is I have one slide left. Next slide. So today, really, I think we want to understand from you the major issues and constraints. We've got a lot of input. Again, please, if you feel like there's other issues or constraints that haven't been addressed, make sure you leave those in writing. Stop by and see one of us. We'd be more than happy to capture that as we go forward. This won't be your only opportunity to provide input, and we'll have other formats in different environments. So we're at the very beginning stage, so I don't want to feel like this is the last chance that you're going to have heard and you won't have any additional chance to comments. We want to understand those things that are important to you, that are strategic or that you consider assets that we want to build off of. We recognize that the neighborhoods are probably one of those, but there's some great businesses in place, and we want to make sure that we protect the important things. One of the stations I was at is the factors. What is important to you? How do you define success? What does success look like, and what does positive outcome look like? We want to make sure that we understand what success looks like from your terms, not ours. And then ultimately, we're going to divide and define an implementation strategy, a merchandising strategy, what types of uses make sense, how to fill those up, and then how would it look in the future in order to activate it. Ultimately, we're going to help prioritize some of the catalyst activities. Again, this is not just a study, but we want to create a plan in terms of implementation. And then we'll look going forward in terms of illustrating and pop-up examples of, facades and landscaping and parking and open space and streetscape and all those elements of how they might work in this environment based on the existing conditions. So with that, the technical team is going to be back at the stations for a few more minutes. I know we're getting close on time, but I want to make sure if you want to stop by and you have any specific questions, please answer those. This project will not be adopted without going through a public process, so we'll be back in front of City Council. We'll have to present it formally. So again, I don't want you to feel like that you didn't get a chance, or maybe you think about something tonight. Let us know, but if again, this won't be the last time you see us or have a chance to provide your input in this process. I also want to thank the mayor and manager and the staff and the church again for putting this all together. And then we're going to close here. We'll spend a few more minutes out at the station. Somebody asked what there is to eat. I think we have cookies and water at least. I know it's getting late, but we'll be more than happy to answer those questions then. Thank you very much.